recall the glory days of the 1980s, the era of extreme fashion, heavy metal, breakdancing, and mixtapes, a unique and fascinating era that is still highly celebrated throughout the world, but not in Latin America. They regard the 1980s as the lost decade because they experienced financial turbulence and a debt typhoon that devastated their economy. Mexico was the first to fall in 1982 when it proclaimed that it would be unable to pay its debt. What followed was a sequence of sovereign defaults throughout Latin America as one country after another was engulfed in the debt crisis. Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador were confronted with a severe recession, soaring inflation, mounting debt, unemployment, and weak economic progress. After 3 decades, history is about to repeat itself. Globally, developing countries are grappling with a sovereign debt crisis. One of them, Sri Lanka, has already succumbed, with its economy collapsing, debt increasing, and foreign reserves decreasing. Of course, the Rajapaksa administration mismanaged the finances, spending more than the national income, allowing deep tax cuts and destroying the economy, but the world did not help. The Sri Lanka crisis continues, and experts claim Colombo is simply the canary in the coal mine. Other countries are supposed to tumble, meaning the entire developing globe is at risk. February 15th, exactly 9 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, the World Bank issued a warning to developing countries about a potential debt catastrophe. The World Bank identified 70 poor and middle-income nations facing debt obligation totaling $11 billion. According to the research, this debt might devastate their economies by 2022. Russia's attack on Ukraine interrupted supply systems, destabilized financial markets, and precipitated a global oil crisis. In March, the United Nations issued this research, which shows that 107 countries' economies face at least one of the 3 risks: rising food costs, rising energy prices, and harsher financial conditions. Together, these 107 countries represent 1.7 billion people, or more than 1/5 of humanity. 9 countries confront all 3 risks associated with food energy financing. 69 countries could follow Sri Lanka's example. There are 25 in Asia Pacific and 19 in Latin America. We'll begin with Egypt, the land of pharaohs. It is experiencing a financial crisis. Egypt is the world's largest importer of wheat, with Russia and Ukraine competing for its supplies. Supplies are running low. Egypt announced last month that its wheat reserves would last only 3 months. Tunisia, the cradle of the Arab Spring, is next. Its economy is overheating, and its foreign debt accounts for 100% of its GDP. The trade imbalance has increased to $800 million. Inflation is at 7%, and fuel costs are at all-time highs. According to analysts, Tunisia may soon experience civil turmoil. Similar warning has been given to Lebanon, the Swiss of West Asia, which will no longer exist in 2020. Blasts devastated Lebanon's major grain storage facilities, and food prices increased 11 times. The Lebanese pound has lost 90% of its value, while the national debt has risen to 360% of GDP. To make matters worse, Lebanon imports 80% of its wheat from Ukraine. The supplies have dwindled, and there is a bread deficit, as well as paucity of sunflower oil. To maintain food security, Lebanon has compelled to accept a $150 million loan from the World Bank. And there's Argentina, the land of tango, which is also in trouble. Inflation is paralyzing its economy, and external debt is piling up. To avoid the 10th default, Argentina has gone to IMF, where it wants to refinance a $45 billion loan. This may give Argentina a temporary reprieve, but it won't stop the civil unrest. According to analysts, Argentina is in for a long and cold winter this year. Other Latin American countries such as El Salvador and Peru are also at risk. They, like Sri Lanka, face hyperinflation in commodities, plummeting bonds, food shortages, exploding prices, and huge unemployment. According to reports, both countries may soon experience civil unrest in sub-Saharan Africa. Economy is choking on rising debt levels and interest payments are choking the economy. Kenya appears to be on the verge of debt disaster. Last week, the debt reached $70 billion, or 70% of GDP. To withstand this economic storm, they received a $244 million loan from the IMF. South Africa's debt has reached 80% of its GDP. In Turkey, the currency is falling, the debt is rising to 54% of GDP, inflation has reached 70%, and the GDP estimate has been reduced to 3.3%. There is a food scarcity. Turkey receives 50,000 tons of wheat from India. According to the World Bank, as many as a dozen developing economies may be unable to service their debts within the next 12 months. This will be the most significant debt catastrophe in a generation. Next up is India, which will suffer the effects of a few state economies that are already in debt. The debt to GDP ratio in Punjab, West Bengal, Bihar, and Andhra Pradesh is identical to that of Sri Lanka. Now here's the thing, the entire world is in debt difficulty. National budgets are at breaking point, forcing some governments to cut spending while others borrow more to stay afloat. We consulted with experts and produced a roadmap of what they believed needed to be done urgently and collaboratively. Number 1, manage borrowing and lending better. Creditors should offer borrowers contingency plans to suspend repayments if the borrower runs into financial issues. Number 2, introduces improved methods for dealing with shocks and crises. External crises are always a threat to low-income countries. Because a large percentage of their debt is in foreign currency, their economies are exposed to external changes. We need to build a mechanism to protect them against such shocks, as well as a tool to restructure unsustainable debts better. Solution 3 enlarges the eligibility conditions for the common framework. What exactly is it? It is a G20 framework designed to assist disadvantaged countries in restructuring their debt. So yet, this paradigm only applies to 73 of the world's poorest countries. It should be broadened to include additional heavily indebted countries as well as vulnerable lower and middle income countries. Solution 4 supports alternatives to borrowing from low-income countries that confront significant public funding gaps, especially for basic public necessities like healthcare and education. According to studies, if these countries improve tax collection, they will be able to borrow less. The fifth solution promotes both borrowers and lenders' accountability and openness. For example, the World Bank has frequently expressed worry over the terms of lending by Chinese creditors. A 2021 study discovered that Chinese contracts have unusual secrecy requirements. This is the most important takeaway from the pandemic. Any catastrophe can have a domino effect. A small event in a distant nation might set off an irreversible chain reaction, so Sri Lanka could be only the beginning. It is impossible to determine where it will finish.